Hello and welcome to the Majlis, Ready for Your Freedom Liberties Current Affairs Podcast focusing on Central Asia. I'm Mohammed Tahir, the host of the Majlis Podcast and Ready for Your Freedom Liberties Media Manager here in Washington, D.C. It's been almost 4 years since Shavkat Mirziyoev assumed power in Uzbekistan as the president. He preceded former President Karimov, who ruled the country with the iron fist, so the expectation was very high. And to some extent, Mirziyoyev did respond to some of those expectations, and for that, he was widely praised both inside and outside of the country. It's been 4 years since he is in power as the president, so it is time to look into his track record as to what changed in Uzbekistan during his time and what are the continued challenges and their possible reasons. To discuss all these, I'm joined by Dr. Jennifer Murtazashvili, Associate Professor at the University of Petersburg, a local governance expert with close eye on Uzbekistan. And we are trying to get a journalist from Tashkent. He is having some trouble with joining via Skype. Let's see. In the meantime, we also have Alisher Siddiq, who is the Director of Radio for Your Freedom Liberties Uzbek Service. He's joining us from Prague. And Bruce Pannier, the Editor of Radio for Your Freedom Liberties Central Asia blog, Kishlok Awazi. Thank you, colleagues, for joining us today on this important conversation. So it's a huge topic. I'm sure we won't be able to discuss every aspect of it. So let's try to cover as much ground as we can in 45 minutes. To do that, I will be unusually kind of disruptive. I hope you won't mind that. So with that, what are some of the main areas where we have seen visible changes over the past 4 years and areas that remain complicated? Maybe we can start with Dr. Murtazashvili.
Sure. Thank you, Tahir. And thanks for organizing this really important conversation. I think it's a really important time to be having this conversation because reforms are at a very interesting point in Uzbekistan. And this is not to be expected. You summarized it very nicely, that there was a lot of momentum. President Mirziyoyev came to power 4 years ago, promising huge changes. And I think one of the most surprising things for me continues to be President Mirziyoyev's rhetoric, how he describes the reforms, what he promises about the future, especially on issues like democracy and human rights. Unlike 15 years ago, when I was working in Tashkent on these issues, it was the international community that was really pushing these issues and making a big statement, making big, powerful statements about the importance of human rights and democratization. And today, the international community has really changed its tune, is much more subdued on these issues. And it's the Uzbek government that has become the most vocal advocate of these issues to its own people. That raises enormous expectations on the side of the people about what they are expecting in terms of what the government can be providing.
Yeah, Jennifer, he's talking about all these big picture promises, but is he delivering anything? Anything has changed?
So a lot of things have changed. I think it's really unfair to say nothing has changed in Uzbekistan in the past 4 years. So much has changed. The economy has opened up. Foreign policy has opened up. Borders have opened up. It is easy to access the country. You can actually do social science research in the country. That was not possible before. I mean, as a social scientist, I'm speaking for myself here. Society is much more dynamic than it was in the past, not because people were incapable of being dynamic. It's that they are now unleashed to achieve much more of their potential. Now, are there no limits on this? Of course there are limits on them. I think people like Alisher Siddiq, it's too bad he's not here right now. He could speak about where these limits are. People are figuring this out, and it's changing. It's very dynamic. So these economic opportunities are really creating the ground for long-term growth. The foreign policy changes are enormous. So there's lots of very positive changes, but the reforms are still very much in progress.
Okay. So talking about changes, I will get to what remains the same in a bit, and we are going to get to the specifics of all what Jennifer has just said. First, I wanted to take your general thoughts. Bruce, what's your thought on the same question about what have changed so far?
You definitely have to say that it looks a lot different than it did, 10 years ago. There's no doubt about that. Even when he first came to power, I mean, you could tell that his big thing was going to be foreign policy. And certainly the changes in Uzbekistan's foreign policy, particularly its regional policy, have been significant to say the least. domestic policy, it's always hard to say how much of this is so entrenched in the system that it's hard for them to pull out of the rut and get going in the right direction, or how much of it is tolerated at the top. I mean, there have been high-profile prisoners have been released from jail, and that's all very good. There's supposedly the presidential virtual reception site on the internet, and people have, from what I've heard, been writing in with their complaints or comments about what's going on in the country. There's more criticism on the internet about the Uzbek government, and this is a very relative statement, but people do seem to feel sufficiently emboldened and possibly comfortable with writing criticism about mostly local officials and their policies. And sometimes that gets results. At the same time, we still see that there are people at the top who are absolutely off limits for any kind of criticism at all. Former President Karimov's daughters were infamous for taking a lot of the money, but President Mirziyoev's sons-in-law have seemed to be occupying more and more of the domestic space, both in politics and business in Uzbekistan. So that's some shift there. But, just in brief, the regional policy certainly is 180-degree turn from what it was into the Karimov era. And you can see that that's appreciated by all the neighbors. That's also clearly a good sign of progress.
Alisher, your thoughts on those lines?
It's a very broad topic, as you said.
Yeah.
There's a huge list of what has been accomplished and what could not be accomplished and what will never be accomplished. Of course, we cannot cover everything. If I give you the broad picture, there's President Karimov, the first president of Uzbekistan, lowered the bar so low that every whisper sounds like a nuclear explosion, sounds like a reform. Of course, what government did, and they approached a couple of things smartly with the good consultants. I know a couple of them. They're young, educated guys, and they sort of came up with this idea that to identify why Karimov was criticized all these years. They identified these points. What was that? And it turned out that it's nothing that's not possible to do, like releasing political prisoners of Karimov. They're old people who were serving their long-term sentences for nothing. The best thing they can do, they go back to their families and you never hear from them. That's actually what happened. I mean, they never been any opposition. That was easy to accomplish. Then opening borders. Interesting topic, because it turned out that opening borders it plays in favor of Uzbekistan more than it plays in favor of others, because Uzbekistan is a huge market, and then now neighbors will start closing the borders soon, Uzbekistan produces a lot of products. It's not Uzbekistan's problem anymore. It's a neighbor's problem. So improving relations, another thing, like normalizing a little bit of forced labor has been a big thing. They've been doing a lot of stuff on that, but still the system is not reformed and forced labor is still there. So it might not be a child labor at this point, but it was not possible to accomplish. So by talking to people in the West, by identifying these critical moments, they could reach to people like Jennifer, like others, to give them impression that something huge is happening. But when you go below that and see what actually happening, where's money going, it's what we actually always track. You see that the corruption, embezzlement is occurring in the scale unheard of, even under Karimov. The embezzlement, the corruption is beyond any level of Gulnara or of their daughters. President Mirziyoev's family, his friends, his former associates, they control whole sectors of economy. They borrowed already over $20 billion international credits. No one knows where they are. So when it comes to making money and embezzlement and corruption, that is what's happening. And unfortunately, this story is not being told very well at this point, but it's coming.
Wow. The opinions couldn't be more diverse on this panel. So please interact, speak up when you have something to add or react to.
I just want to respond to that. With all due respect, Alisher, I spent a lot of time in Uzbekistan at different levels in the country, villages. I've spent, I'm not here to defend my record, but the idea that, outsiders are so easily impressed by what's happening, I'm here to complicate the story, and I don't see everything in such black and white terms. And I've spent a lot of time outside of Tashkent recently. I've spent a lot of time, trying to understand people's perceptions of what's happening. And I think it's really easy for us to sit on the outside and say, wow, it all seems like these are very superficial changes, and when the bar is so low. But when you're so afraid, right? When you have very limited freedoms and you experience those things, this is a big change. This is a big change for people. This isn't such a big change for outsiders. Outsiders really haven't been engaged in Uzbekistan for very long. And one of the things you notice on the streets of Tashkent is like Gaishniki, they're gone. You don't see them anymore. And people are not afraid to videotape them. People are not afraid to upload these videos to the internet. I mean, you can't underestimate the effect that has on people's abilities to want to push forward on so many things. Yes, I agree that these issues of corruption are there. The issues of corruption have been there. They were much more tightly controlled in the past. And you raise a very important question that many people in Uzbekistan are asking, right? They're asking about what's happening to these loans. And these questions are not just being raised by outsiders, but this was a case, just a couple of weeks ago. This young blogger, wrote that letter about what's happening to the ADB funding, what's happening to this international donor funding. He gets hauled into the police. But now people are discussing these issues. And yes, it may seem like this was a very low bar, but these are very important conversations for people in Uzbekistan to be having. And I think that the fact that they're having these conversations, that people are writing these issues from Tashkent, not just from the outside, is a really huge change. And the reforms obviously are very, very imperfect. But I think it's, as a social scientist, I'm looking at this, well, why would we expect this to be perfect? What are we looking at from the past 30 years that would tell us that this is going to be heaven in 2 days?
Alisher, anything to respond? Otherwise, we will move on. I think...
there are big things, and we're trying to identify those, critical things, rather than
Absolutely.
To try to flesh out the idea itself, the purpose. Yeah. So Mirziyoev is there for 4 years. He will be there for another 4 years and beyond. That's the whole thing. Yeah. So that's where the problem is. And his associates, former people who helped him to come to power, to saved him from jail so many times with their money. Now they are on the top of the government. And the scale of enriching themselves is, as I said, what you see on the streets. These are like, or here, like from Gaishniki, street. This is just a facade. So let's try to dig deeper. And that's what I'm trying to say. If you dig deeper, you'll find his family members, his friends, and multiply it to the number of years he's gonna stay in power. And then as a social scientist, you must understand that you cannot judge things from what you see right now. Yeah, but you need to go deeper into analyzing the trend, the trajectory of the policy. So the trajectory is very dangerous. And there's no political movements. There's no political position in the country.
Very interesting. The press is what we care about the most, among many other things, as the news organization. So talking of press from one aspect, I'm going to give you two examples, one slightly positive and the other slightly negative. From one aspect, at least on the surface, you see a change, like some semi-independent media organizations started surfacing, as Jennifer was talking about. It became possible for people to express their opinions on social media on some issues, though there are lots of limits. And on the other hand, in preparation to this show, I was trying to get people from Tashkent on board for this discussion. One reporter, now he's former reporter, what was his exact word? Yeah, he said it became too dangerous for him to talk about press freedom related issues in his own words, and he also said that the press freedom project is over. Then I contacted another reporter, the reporter we wanted to have today. He apparently agreed, but he had his own frustrations about the situation of press freedom in his last tweet, which reads like, maybe I'm getting to the end of the road in this journey. Referring to the journalism, independent journalism. So in terms of press, Bruce, as a journalist, what is your assessment of what has happened so far?
Well, certainly it's been from when Mirziyoev came to power, it's kind of been a process of finding out where the borders are on what you can report on. I don't doubt that there's a number of journalists in Uzbekistan who, given the chance, would report on all kinds of issues that are really important and vital for the country, including, getting way down into the issue of corruption and who is taking all the money from the country and things like that. But we've seen consistently that as people test the limits, they find out where the limit is. I mentioned earlier that you can criticize provincial and district officials. That's fine, but the higher you get, the less possible that is. You can identify some of the people that Ali Shearer was referring to are getting real rich off the country just by what you are able to say or not say about them when they come up. The mayor of Tashkent is a classic example. Here's somebody who's really, really rich, who was brought back into power by Mirziyoyev, but the press, when they did cover him, remember he told one of the journalists that he might disappear when he leaves his house one night, right? And he's still the mayor, even after that. So you can see that there's the desire on the part of some people in the media to really push forward as fast as possible. But you can also see that since there were so many topics that were off limits in the past, which ones are possible to do now is still a question that's in the air, although we're finding out, like I said, as they move forward and try to report on these things, then we find out here's an area that's off limits or here's an official that you can't talk about. So I don't know what an acceptable limit is. Of course, everything's complicated by the coronavirus. In Uzbekistan, there's an example of what can you report and what can't you report. Now, the figures the Uzbek government releases on how many cases and how many deaths they have are not believable, right? They're too low. But for the most populous country in Central Asia, it's with a couple million migrant laborers, many of whom have come home from Russia and other places, and still they're far below what you'd expect. And the ratio of deaths to cases is extremely low. Journalists probably figured this out, but this is a dangerous topic to report on. You don't want to contradict the government on this because they have their own version of what's happening, and that's what they want everyone to believe. So you can't say the government's lying. It's 10 times worse than what you're hearing. Just for one example.
Yeah.
And I think this is a really important issue because, Ali Shearer, he spoke about, these understanding where these limits are and understanding the real dangerous moments. And I think if we're going to talk about the real dangerous moments, I think they're happening right now. And the journalists who have not wanted to join this program, there's two prominent journalists, including Ali Shearer who was the one who posted about the limits on the end of the road. I think he posted something not long ago, and Makarenko has been very vehement in saying that the freedom of speech that Uzbekistan enjoyed is over now. And I think one of the issues that we've observed is after the COVID crisis, you saw the security services sort of rear their ugly heads again. They were not so involved in government policy. They were not at the decision-making table. And I think Mirziyoyev, it's my understanding, I don't have insider sources, it's just from what I've observed and from my conversations with people, is that they didn't play a really important role in many of the reforms after a while. And that was one of the things that he really worked hard on was, creating space for some of these young people and these policy entrepreneurs and people who are educated abroad, right, to come back to the country and have a seat at the policy table. And of course, that's not easy. Doing those reforms and the kinds of reforms that Mirziyoyev has proposed are not easy in any country, especially given the very low bar that we've discussed. You're going to have vested interests. You're going to have people that fight back. That's to be expected. That is normal. Look across the post-Soviet space. That's what we should expect, okay? But what happened after COVID is that we saw the securitization of so many different aspects of life. And this has really stalled the reform process. It's really led to many of the reversals, the arrests of so many bloggers. We saw the detention of Baba Murad in Bishkek, which raised so many questions. And to me, this really seemed like a blast from the past. Like, and then Mirziyoev comes and makes another speech again, right, talking about the importance of press freedom, and press freedom will never die. And I think the real danger, the dangerous moment that we see right now is this increasing gap between the rhetoric and the actions. And, Karimov, whatever we may think of him, he didn't really speak in these kinds of terms, right? So people's expectations, they knew what to expect. It was pretty consistent. And now we're seeing this lofty rhetoric still return, and limits on these freedoms seem to return again. And I think there's an enormous amount of confusion. If anything else, this will lead to a major stall in the reform process and can reverse a lot of the things that have happened.
And also, we so far discussed about corruption and press, and also there is the element, and of course, very important one, human rights and political freedom. So speaking of political freedom, so opposition parties remain in exile, and there is no genuine opposition in the country, and it doesn't look like we will have them anytime soon. So from this perspective, although there's some changes and so much noise about openness in Uzbekistan, when compared even with most of its neighbors, excluding Turkmenistan, of course, Uzbekistan is still lagging behind in some of those issues. So let's continue the debate talking about some of the areas which remains complicated in the country, why it is so, and what it can take to break through. And this breakthrough can be expected from Mirziyoev, given his past 4 years in the office. So we will continue the discussion talking about these and many other questions very shortly. First, let me recap the debate today on the Majlis Podcast. I'm joined by Dr. Jennifer Murtazashvili, Associate Professor at the University of Pittsburgh, Alisher Siddiq, the Director of Radio Free Europe Radio Liberties Uzbek Service. And also we have Bruce Pannier, the Editor of Radio Free Europe Radio Liberties Central Asia blog, Kishlok Owazi. I'm Mohammed Tahir, Radio Free Europe Radio Liberties Media Manager and host of the Majlis Podcast here in Washington, D.C., and we are discussing President Mirziyoyev's 4 years in the office. So the things which remain complicated, the political situation. So one thing is very clear here. I guess there was at least one election under Mirziyoyev. Was that election any different compared to the past? Who wants to take this question? Maybe Bruce, you were...
They made it into a more interesting show than usual. But no, in the final analysis, there was no genuine opposition parties. There were no independent candidates allowed. The parties that did, that were participating, the same parties that have been participating. Admittedly, it was a lot more flashy when they did the debates, and they did bring up some topics that they probably never would have talked about under Karimov. But at the end, at least I came away with the feeling that this was just another scripted election, and the results were known, how many seats for how many parties long before people actually went to the polls and cast ballots. People got more excited about it, the electorate. I'll give them, I suppose that's encouraging. There were people that talked a lot more about the politics, but, in the end, the result was essentially the same as far as I could see.
Anything, Jennifer, you focus on governance issues. Any thoughts you have on that?
Yeah, I was there during the parliamentary election campaign. I wasn't there for the election day itself, but I think Bruce sort of hit the nail on the head with this. On the one hand, like a lot of it, when I first saw the election campaign materials distributed by the government and the election it was like throwback. It was like, this was old style election stuff. Why are they doing this? I mean, this is what the point that I'm trying to make is that, and I think that to talk about bigger issues, I think on many issues there really is a desire to reform, but often I think the government just doesn't have the tools to do it. But on the election issue, and that's a whole nother separate governance issue we can discuss, but on the election issue, I think you did see a lot of people much more animated. People were participating in discussions. Was it a deep political party discussion? No, but at the local level, you saw people taking positions associated with parties. You never saw that kind of thing before. You never saw those kinds of discussions on policy-related issues. Was the result Predictable, yes, obviously it was. But what has been the consequence of that? I think that we have seen a more active parliament than we have in the past. They're getting involved in certain issues. Now, someone could say that that's scripted. We could say that that was, predictable, but they are engaging in public debate. And I think I know some people who are elected to parliament, they seem very genuine and care about very specific issues. That is different. So I think what we're seeing is like the beginnings of some kind of scaffolding for a longer term reform, but I think the kinds of political reforms that you're speaking of are a very long way off.
Okay. On that, Alisher, I mean, though there has been some, vibrant atmosphere when the election was taking place, at least on the surface, people were talking about gathering for political rallies, at least to listen to some of those candidates. But once they are in the parliament, in the political scene, how much those vibrancy translated into their action
of a member of parliament?
Yeah.
I mean, frankly, we didn't even cover this election on Radio Free Europe or Uzbek service because it's not interesting. It's just doesn't make any sense because people who are elected, they have no impact. It's another facade that the whole world should look into and say, oh, they have parliamentary system. They have two chambers, or upper chamber, lower chamber. But then go and look into laws and look into executive orders and look into everything, what is related to real, economy or social reforms. You'll see only one body from where all the laws and rules and orders come from the president's office. So there's no second, this system never shared with others. Yeah. So president gives to parliament, they put the stamp on it, and it's out there. So what's the point of a public debate, of them talking? Even President Mirziyoev himself referred to parliament once. He said, "Why you are not barking?" He said, "Sometimes you need to bark." Literally, he said. Wow. So that's the attitude. That's the whole system, which is the same, which was under President Karimov, essentially. Opposition, you think there are people who are ready to sacrifice their lives?
What do you mean?
Go and launch some opposition party in Uzbekistan, and I'll see how long it will take before you disappear or something happens to you. So that's why it has never been there, and it will never be there. The real one which can challenge Mirziyoev directly, his policies, his reforms, his statements. What you see is just a criticism of things that completely irrelevant to president's policy. So it is a control over everything what's been said. You're talking about independent media. Okay, let's do investigation, and you'll see the ownership and who established this media. So you have one media outlet that controlled by prosecutor's office, another one by Tashkent's mayor, another one by another guy in the government. I mean, I don't want to name everything, but it's more subtle than Karimov's regime. Yeah, that's for sure.
Yeah, but Alisher, it's complicated, and I don't have any first-hand details to agree or disagree with what you are saying. However, one thing that I see happening in Uzbekistan is that in the past we never had people joining our programs from Tashkent, but during the last couple of months we succeeded in getting few people on board, which is something new and wasn't possible during Karimov's era, at least during the number of years leading to his death. Maybe it's also part of just,
Who said it was... No, again, Tahir, who said it wasn't possible under President Karimov's fourth year in power? Do you know what happened when Karimov was in his 4 years in power? It was Radio Free Europe freely working in Uzbekistan. There were source organizations. All these organizations were there. We were there. What are you talking about, Tucker?
Yeah, that's different era, Alisher. I know that time. We used to have a bureau in Tashkent and multiple journalists on the ground, but the bureau was closed along with the offices of many other independent organizations. So what I'm saying is that the era prior to 2005, that was a different time compared to what we are seeing now and what we have seen during Karimov's years preceding 2005 events. That's what I mean.
Right. We always judge last 5 years of Karimov's regime, and he was 25 years in power.
Right.
So let me just jump in here for a second. During that period, I don't want to adjudicate the 90s and the 2000s, but I was working at USAID in Tashkent. I spent 2 years in Samarkand from 97 to 99, and I managed USAID's democracy promotion programs in Uzbekistan until 2002. And I can tell you, we funded hundreds of NGOs. And yes, on paper, it looked like there was a lot of things going on. It looked like there was a lot of civil society organizations. There was a very brief period of time where there were some independent media organizations. Those were done by 1999, 2000.
No, we were there until 2005. I mean, our people were everywhere, and they were doing their professional independent reporting.
But RFE-RL was, but I'm talking about local media, okay? I'm talking about local civil society organizations, and although there were thousands of them, they were not engaged in advocacy work. Yes, they could register, right? Yes, it looked like something was happening, but they were not engaged in the kinds of advocacy issues that you see happening today, right? And I'd like to think that I was very effective in my work at that time, but it wasn't. If you compare the level of engagement and the kinds of issues that people are actually debating, it's much more difficult to register an organization now, but even without registration, people have much more of a voice. Is it perfect? Can they talk about everything? Absolutely not. Nobody's saying that. Can they talk about a lot more? Absolutely, yes.
Interrupt you, Jennifer, on that point. I just really want to interrupt you. You're talking about the time when there was no internet, when there was no telegram, social media. So if social media would be back then, I know history is not the iffy question. So what actually contributes to the current situation is not Mirziyoyev, it's just the technology, it's internet, it's the world itself is much more open.
That's a valid point.
People were afraid until 3 or 4 years.
No, if you have social media back then, the Facebook would explode back then. So today, media is just catching up with what already been expressed out there. Yeah. So it's whatever is happening now, it's pushed by technology itself, by life, in general. So I'm not saying that the situation in Uzbekistan is stuck. Yeah. So it just slowly developing. It's getting better in general. What contributes to it, it's more like a general world development. That's my
thank you, Alisher. We really need to move on. Bruce, let me bring you on, taking the discussion back to politics and opposition. President Mirziyoyev is also not letting the opposition in exile to come in, though I think that could help him a lot to advance his PR machine with almost no harm, I guess, given those opposition figures are in exile for so many years, decades, and probably have no followers in the country. So why not he's doing that, especially in the atmosphere where he's kind of trying to create the beginning of something new?
Well, that's obviously the traditional opposition groups, ERK or Birlik or something. I mean, it's fair to say that their leadership has aged, and most of them, a lot of them have been outside. The leaders actually have been outside of the country for two decades or something like that. For what it's worth, ERK, if you remember, and I know Alisher will, ERK did try to get its party registered in January this year. And they went to the Justice Ministry, and the Justice Minister essentially told them that there was, no, you can't be registered and you never will be registered. The sad thing is I've already started to hear some talk from officials in Uzbekistan. You see them start to say, okay, well, economic reform and then political reform, but that was Karimov's mantra. And the problem with that was they never had the sufficient economic reform to ever implement political reform. They are, again, Jen was talking and made some good points too, and about the 90s, and Alisher was saying it too. In the 90s, there actually were, ERK and Birlik weren't registered, but they could still move around, and there was even other groups that were starting to pop up. I mean, the Sunshine Coalition showed up 2005, 2006. So it was possible. I mean, but now it's like absolutely impossible at this moment. Mirziyoyev's hinted at that. He said, we're considering how that's going to work. But, you'd hate to think they'd go down the same road as like the Kazakh government recently when they said, okay, well, we're going to permit opposition parties, but they seem to imply that they were going to create their own opposition parties, from above instead of letting it come from below. And I haven't seen any indication that Uzbekistan is willing to budge on this at the moment. I would think a better first step forward would be to allow independent candidates. Because they really are in no position to hurt to threaten the government, because it's only one person. But organized parties, I'd like to think they're willing to make that jump and let a legitimate, genuine opposition party show up, if for no other reason than the criticism, necessary criticism on the government for what they're failing to do, and force the issue to come out in public and hopefully be resolved. But like I said, I've never seen any comments from any Uzbek officials that indicated that they were even considering letting opposition parties be formed, organically as they should be, and not from above by order of the government.
Yeah, as I stated at the beginning of the discussion, there are a lot to talk about Uzbekistan, but I guess we are not going to be able to discuss everything. In the meantime, we have to conclude the discussion very soon, but just very final points here. So, Jennifer, let me bring you in. With some changes, still there are many issues, major issues, which remain unchanged in the country. Why is that the President Mirziyoev is kind of a sole decision maker there? Why he's not going to that direction, political pluralism? I mean, what it will take for him to move that direction?
I don't think any of us know the answer to that question. I mean, that's just speculation. What will it take? The country was in good economic shape before the reforms. I think this is sort of a misunderstanding that the country was going broke or something. It wasn't. And I think the reforms, just like in so many other countries right now, facing economic crises, it's going to be harder to push those reforms forward. But unfortunately, they become much more important during time of crises, especially the governance issues. We've talked a lot about the political issues, but the actual reform of how the state works is, I think, the biggest issue facing society, facing the country right now, and it is the legitimacy question that I think Mirziyoyev is going to have to face with his citizens. Because people, at the end of the day, they really care about services, they care about, their dignity, how they're treated, what's happening in the schools. Mirziyoyev has done, one of the really interesting changes that you see, and I think we've talked about this before, is, the ability to talk about rural poverty, the ability to show the life conditions in rural areas. These things are now being, talked about on television, but the government's tools to respond to them have not changed. There hasn't been any real reform of governance in service delivery, in subnational governance. The president's talked about elections for hakims and lots of things. And those things can actually help provide, citizen preferences into what happens at the local level. But we're not seeing any of that. But that is not easy, and we haven't seen a lot of it actually throughout the post-Soviet space. To suggest that it's easy.
It's Jennifer. Look into some of the neighboring countries in Kyrgyzstan and other countries. We have seen those how opposition works, how they can kind of make the government authorities accountable. But none of those things are seen in Uzbekistan. Although there is lots of discussions about the openness and everything, and there is it's a good thing to see that people are talking about some of those basic issues. But when it's not translated into real change in the country, people will keep talking, but government will not
exactly
respond.
And that's the biggest challenge, is they're raising the expectations and they're not delivering on the things that they're promising. And this is the gap. So, that, when Ali Sher's talking about this dangerous moment, I think this is actually it, when this rhetoric sort of continues and you don't deliver on the things that you yourself have promised.
Okay, Bruce, I will also take your point on that, and Ali Sher. Also one very kind of a pressing question from my perspective is he the guy who will bring about all those changes?
Yeah, obviously as I said, he's not Václav Havel. He's not Lee Kuan Yew or Mahathir Mohamad or whoever you wanna. You need to go and see into his background. He was doing all 4 years trying to sort out the mess that was left after Karimov, and he was actually involved in creating this mess. He was 16 years his prime minister, and we should not forget about it. So the guy has no international experience or knowledge about the world. He never traveled beyond Uzbekistan during his 16 years. He has limited knowledge about democracy and everything. What he's trying to shape is something that comes from his own vision. Again, he's not bad. He's 4 years, he's legitimate president, let's put it this way at this point. But the problem starts when they decide to remain in power. The bigger problem starts. So do we have seeds of, or any, let's say, projection that in 4 years we no longer see him? Does he act like he wants to leave? No, he's not acting like that. So he's acting like business as usual style. Yeah. So I'm there, I'm here, and I'm forever. So that's the most worrying issue. For me personally, as a Uzbekistan watcher, I see that's what is the most dangerous aspect of politics in Uzbekistan.
Yeah, I think this should be my final question then, when I will get answers from all of you to this, if you can. So I think there are so many issues, and since he has been in power and unchallenged ruler of the country, I think his excuses are increasingly running thin, given he's there already for 4 years. And as I said, unchallenged. Can we expect anything to change in his remaining 1 year? So, I think my question should be, what are the areas that you will be looking to, Jennifer, to determine where he's taking the country in the remaining time that he's in the office?
So one of the areas is going to be privatization. And, for better or worse, the country hasn't privatized its large-scale state-owned enterprises. And we know we're talking about problems with corruption right now, but those issues could get much, much worse, as we've seen from other countries in the region. When you start privatizing those large-scale enterprises, that's when you see large-scale oligarchs emerge and things like that. Uzbekistan doesn't have those right now. There's some involvement from people from the outside, or Uzbeks, who gain their wealth in Russia, but you don't have that domestically right now. Also keeping my eye on many of the foreign policy issues. But finally, I think the issue the country's in a crisis. The whole region's in a crisis right now. I mean, every country in the world is facing this COVID, pandemic. And, the World Bank still says Uzbekistan's economy will grow, but people are facing enormous challenges outside of the capital and even inside the capital. So crises can lead to change, for better or for worse. And so it'll be interesting to keep an eye on this.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Bruce and Alisher, please jump in.
What I'll be looking for is how the government directs the country as it comes out of the COVID crisis, and the whole region does, and how it acts. Where will the emphasis be on regional policies, right, or on domestic policies? And they're not necessarily separate. One point I would throw in is that, and I've written this before, is that so much of what Mirziyoev has done can be explained by him trying to get legitimacy and cement his power. So when you look at his calls for reforms and what he's done economically for the country and what he's done regionally in terms of relations with his neighbors, that all helps him in the end. So I'm really trying to figure out where, as this crisis dies down, is he going to look to make Uzbekistan the regional power? I mean, they've really stepped forward. They were a non-player in the region, but now they are a much bigger player and possibly the big player, the regional hegemon coming out of this. And how will that affect how he treats his domestic reforms? Or will he be more interested in cementing Uzbekistan's position as the key country, which it was, in the 90s. Other people have pointed out in the 1990s, every international organization that had an office, if they only had one office in all of Central Asia, it was in Tashkent. And it was only Karimov who chased everybody out. Right. Okay. Final point, Alisher. So where you will be looking at going forward? To determine.
No, my personal issue is, of course, the press freedom situation. So I want that to continue to continue. I think it's evolving. I think there's more air, and I hope that the range of topics and will continue to expand, and journalists will be new kind of a, let's say, generation of journalists would appear in a while. So that's what I want to see, in first place, or the area that I will keep looking at. Another area, of course, is a little bit dangerous, I think, and Karimov identified this thing. It's a Islamization of Uzbekistan. So now, as you know, under Mirziyoev, there's more freedom for these things, for Islamizations. And we already heard from imams all sorts of wild sermons and stuff, including like banning male doctors in maternity hospitals, stuff like this, So I'm looking into that, whether Mirziyoev will continue, offering more liberties for these type of religious groups. So another thing is, of course, looking into his family members, where they're going, how they are moving, and his closest associates. If he's able to put a couple of them in prison, that's could be very interesting for me.
Alisher, you have these very bold statements and predictions. It definitely needs exploring. Maybe we will come back to this topic a little bit later. I mean, the election, I think, should be coming up like in 1 year, I guess. So, of course, we will keep eye on Uzbekistan, how it goes, where things are headed. And with this, I think for today, we should end the discussion here. Thank you very much, Alisher Siddiq, the Director of Radio Free April Liberties Uzbek Service. And also big thanks to Dr. Jennifer Murtazashvili, Associate Professor at the University of Pittsburgh, and Bruce Pannier, the Editor of Radio Free April Liberties Central Asia blog, Kishlok Awazi. So with that, thank you very much, colleagues, for your time today. And this is it from me, Mohammed Tahir, Radio Free April Liberties Media Manager and host of the Majlis Podcast here in Washington, D.C. Until next week. Bye-bye.